When I first met Paul Strand, I was just starting out in photography. The thing that really struck me, he said, the important thing is you have to have something to say about the world. I had never really thought about it that way. Not just go out and make nice images, but what was it that you had to say about the world?
The portrait of a person is one of the most difficult things to do, because in order to do it, it means you must almost bring the presence of that person photographed to other people in such a way that they don't have to know that person personally in any way, but they still are confronted with a human being that they won't forget, that the image of whom they will never forget. That's a portrait.
In 1906, when Strand was starting out in photography, he went to visit Alfred Stieglitz's little gallery in New York. Stieglitz was the most influential photographer in America at that time. At the gallery, he saw not only Stieglitz's work, but all the leading American and European photographers. That day, he decided, this is what I want to do. He went out and imitated what he had seen. He was using soft focus to create the look of paintings. Photographers at that time were using soft focus to prove that photography was more than just mechanical reproduction. It was art. Two years later, he came back to Stieglitz and said, look, see what I've done.
You see, Stieglitz was a kind of an idol to Paul. He got acquainted with him when he was about 16 and started to photograph. And he would always bring his photographs to be seen. And Stieglitz would beat him unmercifully. Oh, I would be embarrassed sometimes the way they'd carry on.
Stieglitz wasn't interested in young photographers imitating. By this time, he was tired of pictorial photography. In his gallery, he was showing the work of the European modernists. Artists like Matisse, Picasso, Braque had never been seen in America. This art was entirely strange and very upsetting to the public.
I was puzzled too, but interested. And finally, after a time, I thought I began to understand what they were driving at. These painters were trying to get at and emphasize the abstract elements of form. I concluded that a photograph, to be a work of art, must also contain this kind of unity. That subject matter alone was not enough.
After his experiments with abstraction, he wanted to look at the world and apply what he had learned. When you go out into the world with a camera, you have to work with reality as it is. You can't change it. You have to find an order in the chaos. As Strand said, find out what it is you have to say and make it work in a rectangular space. He did this with Wall Street.
He was sensing certain contradictions, not only in American society, but in an industrial and a commercial environment. So you get a broad range there, from Wall Street, the banking center of the world at that point, to the people who were selling pencils. I've always felt that that early group was the point at which Paul broke through and became the important photographer in the United States. I think before that, Stieglitz would have been. It sort of points to almost the direction that 20th century photography was going to take, as opposed to 19th century romantic pictorialism. And this was a real break.
When Stieglitz saw this work, he was totally unprepared. He'd never seen anything like it. He arranged a show in his gallery, which hadn't shown photography for years. The work is brutally direct, he wrote. It is the direct expression of today.
After 8 years of working with the camera, suddenly there came that strange leap into greater knowledge and sureness. In 1915, I became a photographer. What I was interested in, several things. One was how to photograph people without them being aware of the camera. Feeling that what you wanted to say about people was sufficiently humane that you didn't have to ask their permission. So I fixed a false lens at right angle to the real one and went down to the 5 Point Square, a very tough neighborhood at that time, and tried to make a photograph of an Italian. And 2 young fellas watched me. I heard one of them say to the other, "That guy, he was shooting out the side of the camera." At that point, I thought it would be a good idea to move my location, and I made the photograph of the old man with the strange eyes who was sitting in the park nearby. There are photographs of mine that I still look at and wonder how I was able to do it. I still don't know how I was able to do the Wall Street photograph, considering the fact that the plates those days were very slow. And here were all these people moving across camera. They're not sharp in the microscopic sense, but they're sharp. And I swear, I don't know how it was possible to do it.
In 1921, his friend Charles Sheeler had bought a movie camera. When he told Strand about it, he said, "That's interesting, Sheeler. What are you going to do with it?" They decided to make a film in the city, Manhattan. It aroused great interest in Europe because documentary material up to this point was seen only in newsreels. This was the first time that factual material was treated in a poetic and abstract way. It was America's first avant-garde film. He was now making his living as a motion picture cameraman. It was a good time for him. He was in love with Rebecca Salisbury and well established as an artist.
I thought his earlier work was sometimes very beautiful. I had, I think, 2 or 3 pieces that were quite wonderful of plants. You must know those things, that there would be plants, flowers, and rocks. We did some lovely things just of rocks.
Strand sent O'Keeffe some photographs. She wrote back, "When I saw the prints, they made me see you better. It's almost as though you are sitting by me, silent, yet telling me so many things. I want to reach my hand out to you and let you hold it, feeling more definitely what is in you, what you are. He married Rebecca in 1922, and they became close friends of Stieglitz. They spent time together at his summer home at Lake George with his new wife, George O'Keeffe.
Alfred would work up there in the country in the summertime. There were a few people that always wanted to see what he had been doing. And he would put off letting the Strand see it. I don't know, I couldn't tell you why.
Stieglitz may have been jealous of Strand's work, but Strand still looked up to him as a mentor. Rebecca had to warn him that he was absorbing too much of Stieglitz. She told him that he had enough personality of his own, that no man's life parallels another. When I saw the Rebecca portraits, I wondered about their relationship. There's a sadness there. When Strand and Rebecca went up to Canada, to the Gaspé in 1929, it was one of their few vacations together. The photographs he made in the Gaspé were really his first look at the landscape. He said the sense of weight and air in a picture was most important. The weight is created by the dark tones, the roofs, the rock, the boat in the foreground. He has created a sense of depth with his composition of all these elements. The space between the buildings allows the eye to wander out to sea into the sky. In the landscape, you have elements that you don't want, like telephone poles or the clouds are not right. You go out and you want to make a photograph, but it's a white sky, so it's not interesting. You have to wait for it. He was making black and white photographs, and yet he always talked about color in his photographs. So in the Gaspé, he used papers and tones that reflected the cold blue quality of that light you get in the north. Rebecca and Strand's marriage was showing strain. She was spending more time on her own at the Stieglitz summer home or with O'Keeffe in New Mexico. And Strand would go down to visit.
Well, you see, Rebecca lived in his family's house. He lived at his father's. And I don't know, I think there was an aunt or two there. There were several people there. And they all ran Rebecca crazy because they were all deaf. And Rebecca just had a hard time standing it. Well, Rebecca was a very lively, lean young woman. And Strand was thick and slow. They were friends, I think, always, but not built to live together.
When you're alone photographing, observing your surroundings, you begin to feel the elements that make up the life of that place. Whatever it is that makes that place different from any other place. In New Mexico, it's the light. When I went to look at the church in Taos, I could see that's what he was photographing. Not a church, but the light.
Oh dear, you know, time gets the better of you. The last time he came out here, he went to see Rebecca, and I know he didn't come to see me, and I was so amused that he didn't come to see me. Because it is 40 miles further, that's an 80-mile drive, but we didn't think much of driving 80 miles at that time. But he did go to see Rebecca and didn't come to see me.
It was the end of an era, really, for him. Rebecca had left him and settled in New Mexico. His friendship with Stieglitz had ended. So he was on his own.
There are some things that I didn't do that I wanted to do out there, but I never got to do. Which was some photographs inside the churches and portraits of the people who lived there. But I never got to do it. Leaving there in 1932 and going down to Old Mexico was the end, really, of my New Mexico experience.
In Mexico, he started to look again at people in a way that he hadn't done in 15 years. America was in the Depression by this time, but the poverty he saw in Mexico was rooted in their history. Like many of his contemporaries, he was becoming conscious of the need for artists to deal with social reality.
He was looking for something larger to do with his art than I think he remembered the Stieglitz circle doing, making pictures. for the first time in his life, I think he had a feeling that what he was doing had a social bearing, because the social art gave him real moral and intellectual and basically emotional reason for what he was doing. And he wasn't just a dilettante, and he wasn't doing it just to sell commodities.
After his work was exhibited in Mexico, he was invited by the Mexican government to collaborate on a film. This was the first time he was asked to be involved in a film because of his work as an artist. He had spent 10 years making his living as a cameraman, but he wasn't known as a filmmaker. He was put in charge of the overall production. He photographed it and wrote the story with a young Mexican writer. To work with the cast, they brought in a young assistant director from Hollywood, Fred Zinnemann.
So anyway, I went to Mexico, met Paul Strand. He and a small group of Mexican technicians and writers had set up a plan of doing a film about fishermen, about the problems of fishermen. And there was a script in existence. The story as such was rather simple, rather primitive. The equipment was even more primitive. The film was shot silently with an Eckle camera, and it was hand cranked. This was we had no motor on it. We worked with a group of non-actors. They were all native fishermen who were being themselves. There was one actor, one professional actor, who was the weakest of the lot. It's rather amazing that it's still possible with such little means to bring about a piece of film that means something.
It was unlike any other film about Mexico. It didn't take the usual Hollywood view of Mexicans as banditos. They took a documentary approach.
Well, Hollywood at that time had no idea what a documentary was. They just didn't know. You know the story when one of the studio heads, Harry Cohn, was asked, what is a documentary? He said, it's a film without women. And he said, if there's one woman in it, it's a semi-documentary. When it came to motion pictures, he thought in terms of static photography rather than of movement. And the movement came from whatever I did with the movement of the people. But he was very meticulous about the kind of light, the quality of the light, and the mood that he was trying to get, which I think he succeeded in wonderfully well. And I think the film had a great measure of success because of the theme, which had dealt with the oppression of the fishermen by the people who owned the boats, and the efforts of the fishermen to try to arrive at some fair amount of living wage.
The importance of the wave for Strand was that it opened up the possibility of filmmaking as a way of looking at the world, a way to bring about change in the world, He could use his art to serve the people.
I just didn't go along with his philosophy or his political convictions. He was totally doctrinaire, very, very rigid. Totally convinced that this was really the salvation of mankind. His strength was his colossal conviction to do the job he was doing as best he possibly could. He was a perfectionist in the best sense of the word. And as far as photography was concerned, he certainly had that.
As a photographer, he was used to complete control over his medium. Filmmaking was harder for him because he had to collaborate.
Paul, as a human being, is rather reticent and not too inclined to open up and be generous in talking about himself, his emotions, or whatever. So one didn't know too much about his life. He didn't have much contact deeply with people, although he felt very strongly about mankind. I think he loved humanity in the abstract rather than in the specific.
Working with other people was probably what he needed at this time in his life. So in a way, making this film was not only an artistic development, it was an intellectual and emotional one as well.
His work was standing behind a camera, seeing an image, concentrating what was out there into one rectangular image, right? Taking that image into the darkroom and working forever in the darkroom to get a good print, right? All of which had meaning to somebody, to himself, to somebody, right? At this stage in his life, especially after his Mexican experience with a wave, he wanted to join the world. He wanted to come out of the dark room, come out from under the dark cloth, come out from this tunnel connection to one image and be part of his world, which he could be in part. He was also always in the tunnel of himself, too. That's one of the difficulties that people had in working with him, and which I didn't.
When Strand returned to New York, he wanted to continue making films. In Leo Hurwitz, he found a filmmaker he could collaborate with.
He didn't talk about himself very much. His primary concern, I would say, was his work, yeah. And that's, in a way, where the vitality of interchange came from. In other words, he showed me many pictures, and I looked at them and I responded, you see. And out of that response and out of his awareness of my seeing in his photographs what he meant, then something warm and live and rich came up in our relationship.
Politically, they were very close. They were both concerned about the spread of fascism in Europe. So the first film they made was about the resistance to fascism in Spain. Hurwitz edited the film Heart of Spain from footage shot during the Civil War.
Germany and Italy want Spanish steel for guns. Spanish coal for warships. Copper, lead, mercury, zinc. Hitler wants iron. Mussolini wants coal.
By 1937, Strand and Hurwitz felt it was necessary for Americans to know about the violations of civil liberties in their own country.
Pick up the pool room sharks. Give them a badge. Citizens Committee. Plenty of whiskey. Brand new riot guns. Break up the unions once and for all.
With Native Land, they were exploring new ways of making the documentary dramatic. They integrated newsreel footage with recreated scenes. The story was based on real events, events that were affecting the American people at that time.
There was a war against a vast part of the American people, a hidden war with the resources masked and camouflaged. Suppose that we expose the nature of this war.
Leo pushed him beyond his limitations as a still photographer, beyond what he had done in the wave. And you can see the development, particularly in Native Land.
Joseph Shoemaker, Eugene Poulneau. These men were leaders of the modern Democrats. They had almost defeated the Klan in the city elections. They had dared to enter progressive candidates in the primaries, pledged to smash the political machine of the KKK.
One of the things about Native Land is to show the need for a greater alertness, the need for cutting through the insulation in terms of what's going on. It's a question of doing what we're trained not to do, especially in the middle class. We're trained to be blind.
Here was treason in America, the face of fascism. KKK, Black Legion, Associated Farmers, Silver Shirts, Christian Front. Lies, torture, blackmail, lynch law, Dr. Rogers tarred and feathered, ministers, teachers forced from their profession, open terror, and secret persecution. Whatever their mask, these forces hated one thing: the practice of democracy.
Native Land took 4 years to make and was released the day after Pearl Harbor. Domestic civil rights as an issue was lost in the war effort. One of the young actresses in Native Land was Virginia Stevens.
he asked me out. He was very shy when he would ask me out, and sort of a little dry humor in it. And we went to the funniest things. Harold took me to my first burlesque. I'd never seen burlesque. I thought it was quite crummy, you know. But they got a bang, and then they took me, I told you, my wedding night to this, what do you call it, a homosexual cabaret, you see, where the men were the women, you know, what do you call that? I can't think of it now, and I thought, what in the world?
At the time of their marriage, Strand was 46 and Virginia was 23.
And then we drove to the Gaspé because he wanted to photograph again. And this was our honeymoon, but he photographed every day. And you know, the honeymoon is on the edge of such a thing. But what he saw, the things he saw in nature, and the clouds and the surface of the earth together, and wood, the quality of wood and the quality of stone. These things had never been pointed out to me, never been shown to me, so it was a revelation in that way. Photography has passion in it, and great humanitarianism and compassion and so on. But he couldn't sit and touch you and caress you, you see. He could not do that. Oh, I said I entered the dark wood when I married him, and I think that was the feeling of it all the way through. There were wonderful times in the sense that I was being made aware of things I had never been aware of before, and appreciated him in his work and what he was trying to do in the world. But as a human being wanting somebody close, no, it wasn't there.
Years later, when they were on the verge of separation, Strand went to see Virginia's psychiatrist. When he got back, Virginia asked him, "So what did you talk about?" He said, "Photography."
So she said afterwards that some people cannot be analyzed. It takes an ability to look at the facts of one's life and proceed from there. But you see, if he had done that, it might have hurt his work. I mean, he was a visual artist, and he liked to take all that stuff away and simply be clean and clear and work.
His filmmaking career ended with Native Land. He'd had enough of making films, the complications of raising money and other people's egos. He just wanted to return to the pure, simple, not simple, but to the straightforward approach of being alone in the darkroom and making prints. And he said it was a sheer delight to develop a negative again, make a print. After the war, he started working on a book called Time in New England. The text was drawn from 3 centuries of American writing.
How often I visited and revisited those 6 American states. The stone walls, the graveyards and churches, the characteristic houses that told a history of 300 years. A tradition of independence and of rebellion against slavery and religious intolerance. I photographed Susan Thompson several times, but this portrait taken on the steps of the wash house came out of a creative moment brought about partly by her, partly by me. I like to think it will allow others to know something of this exceptional woman, her serenity and her human understanding.
By the time the book was published, the traditions of American democracy were seriously threatened by McCarthyism.
I was very disturbed by the fact that there was so much confusion in the American mind that it permitted such a man to cause so much harm to the lives of innocent people.
The ideals he had worked for since Mexico no longer seemed attainable in America. In 1950, he moved to Europe. Strand's third marriage lasted the rest of his life. It may have had something to do with the fact that Hazel Kingsbury was also a photographer.
He didn't talk about his work very much, except that he'd say, "Come in and see what I've got now." He always wanted me to come in and see. I'd see it in the, in the developer, then I'd see it in the wash water, then I'd see it in the toning bath, and then I'd see it drying. And, he went and inspected his drying prints about 6 times every night.
Did you ever get tired of it?
I sure did. I hate photography now. I never liked it very much, and I really hate photography now. I'm fed up.
Strand had always wanted to do a book on a village. When they went to Italy, he had the idea of collaborating with the great screenwriter Cesare Sabatini. Sabatini had written many of the classics of the Italian neo-realist film movement, films like Bicycle Thief, Umberto D. And these were films that dealt with the daily life and struggle of the people of Italy. And Strand and Sabatini connected. Strand was looking all over Italy for the perfect village, and Sabatini finally suggested, well, why don't we just stick a pin in the map of Italy, and there we'll do the book. Well, Strand rejected the first 2, but the third pin was Sabatini's hometown of Luzzara.
My village isn't too cultured. It's very attached to work, the earth, to commerce, to profits, to the dollar, to the basic necessities.
Well, it was one of those non-picturesque villages. They had a quite hideous Baroque church. the town itself was not very nice. You can see from the pictures it's not very nice. But we found that actually it's like that umbrella picture I love, so if you just went in backyards and barnyards, you found things. And we decided we'd been quite stupid that you could do a book anywhere if you just started.
Sabatini would go out and interview, talk to the people of his village, and record their stories about the war, their lives.
Everyone here had a lot of respect and much affection for Strand. He didn't ask for affection, but it was natural. He allowed it to happen. Because the people felt that he was full of respect towards everyone else. They do not have a great deal of confidence in their point of view, in their imagination. But in their substance, their day-to-day doings, you can always detect something of fantasy. Talking with them, you can pick any Luzzaresi. Something that you would never have thought possible will come out. The Black Shirt Brigade killed my husband. They were searching for my deserter son. Years later, I encountered one of the brigade and said to him, "You put a revolver in my mouth." They put him and the others on trial, but they were freed. I am the postwoman. My husband was named Campagnoni. He was killed at Reggiola because he was a partisan. There are still the bullet signs on the cemetery wall. My daughter was 10 months old. After the liberation, the town made a special funeral for my husband and the others who were killed. All was in tears.
Luzzara was in the heart of the Italian resistance during the Second World War. Now it was 7 years after.
One of the most moving photographs that he made is the Lucetti family. The mother, standing in the doorway, told me about her family. How she married at 18. How 4 of her children had died in infancy. In the 20s, her husband on 2 occasions had been clubbed and beaten by unidentified political assailants. Why? She never knew. In Strand's portrait, she is surrounded by 5 of her 8 sons, each the veteran of a different campaign in World War II. Each a distinct character, but each bound to the woman, to the land represented by that home, that doorway. With its simple perspective, so in tune with the Renaissance masters and its central receding darkness revolving around the mother's hand hanging slack by her side, the photograph pulls us silently into the family. Strand lived between dawn and noon, between the secular Renaissance sensibility and his own mystical inner voice, which may have derived somehow from America's war against slavery and repression. I will always be grateful to Strand for what he made me see about my own townspeople.
After he'd done the Luzzara book, he was traveling around Italy, and he discovered a 15th century painter, Piero della Francesca. He went all over Italy to see this work. He had to see all of it. And here was a painter working in the 15th century that had a similar sensibility. For example, there's a portrait of Piero's Christ. When you look at that portrait, Piero's Christ is a peasant. He's not someone up in the clouds with angels. It's so similar to his portrait of the young peasant in France. Maybe it was a connection he made to this painter, made him feel that he was part of this older tradition of painting and of art that went back to the Renaissance. It was Strand's Hebrides photographs that first touched me deeply. It was as if he had photographed something in me. His photographs expressed an understanding of a culture that I knew. This was the life my grandparents lived. My grandmother told me about our Celtic past and the struggle against poverty and war. She told me about the Highland clearances, how our ancestors were driven off the land, herded onto ships and sent away to Canada. The life of a whole people destroyed. In Strand, I found a man who understood this history and was able to embody it in his photographs. The clearances had ended almost a century ago, but for the people here, that history was spoken of as if it happened only yesterday. He wanted to show that the human spirit can resist with dignity. He found hope there. In Strand's own life, he had often known hopelessness. But I think his photography and the people he chose was his way of fighting that.
People used to ask me, how do you choose to photograph this or that or the other thing? That includes a portrait. It includes everything. It's a question that stops you cold. After some thinking about it, I used to say, well, actually, I don't choose the things that I photograph. They choose me. If I see something, it's because something outside of myself, not inside myself, stops me and says, silently but clearly, look at me. Look at this.
We were looking for a place to stay, and I saw a house up in the hill. And for some reason I said, let's go in there and we'll ask where we can find a place. So I knocked on the door. This man opens the door. He's a priest in his early 40s. He gave me directions and I thanked him. And as I walked down the hill, I felt somehow that I knew this person. And then I realized, of course, that's the little boy in the book. When the Strands came back from the Hebrides, they decided finally to settle in France. They bought a home just outside of Paris in the village of Orgeval. He was 65 years old, and for the first time in his life, he had a permanent darkroom. All these years he had been making wonderful prints in his bathroom or hotel. They weren't sure what they were going to do next, so they decided to photograph the famous, the artists and intellectuals of France.
We would barge into somebody's house and I'd have to make a portrait of somebody I'd never seen before and didn't always know too much about, and without any mystical waiting for the spirit to move. It's just something to be done quickly, directly, without any fooling. I'd work with Picasso, for instance, and he had to go to lunch. I didn't like the way he was dressed, but I didn't want to say, would you mind changing into your work clothes when he's about to go to somebody's for lunch?
I can't think of a visit with Paul without its including looking at his photographs. And the interval between your crossing the threshold and you're finding yourself in this little theater he created for the projection of his photographs was as short an interval as he could manage to make it, because I don't think he fundamentally thought anything was more important than that. And I think it was his form of personal communication with his friends.
He was an extremely serious person. For instance, his humor was never funny. He liked to make puns, and they were excruciating puns. I mean, he really tried hard for them, and he worked at them.
Do you remember any of his puns?
Oh, no, they were terrible. I mean, they were good, but I don't remember puns. No.
When he was 74 years old, he went to Ghana. He was invited by Kwame Nkrumah, who had achieved independence for Ghana from British rule. Strand went there officially to make a book, and he worked like mad. Nkrumah's revolution helped him hold on to his belief that the world could be changed through political action. He loosened up in a way, and he started using a handheld camera for the first time. In some ways, it was an attempt to capture this vitality of the people, and you see groups of people working together. There are images where the compositions become very arbitrary. Faces cut off, heads that are clipped. Very strange compositions that you wouldn't expect from Strand. In Ghana, he's trying everything. He's opening up, becoming freer.
I'm a politically conscious person. I've always wanted to be aware of what's going on in the world around me. The artist, like the true scientist, is a researcher, digging into the meaning of the world.
In the early 70s, 6 years before he died, a major retrospective was put together, and 600 of his photographs were exhibited in Philadelphia, Boston, and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This was a great event for him, because after he had moved to Europe, he couldn't get his books published in America in the 50s and 60s. They were all published in Europe. No one knew his books. But at the very end, he had recognition from America and from Europe as the great master.
We had the first big shock when his cataracts began to get so thick that he couldn't see. He couldn't drive anymore, and he couldn't photograph, and he couldn't work in the darkroom. And he personally thought that he was never going to be able to see to work again.
He was in the darkroom, and I was taking a shower in the bathroom, and both rooms joined each other through a thin wall. And I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard conversations coming out of the darkroom, and he and Hazel were in the darkroom. And Hazel had focused a negative on the easel, and Strand could hardly see at that time. And he said to Hazel, "What's in the upper left-hand corner? What's in the upper right-hand corner?" Almost blind, he was trying to print the photograph through Hazel's eyes.
But then when he got back from those operations and he could see, he didn't drive, but he got the camera out and he started snapping in the garden like crazy.
When you come to the end of seeing, when seeing is only looking, then you've reached the end of your road. I don't know, seems to me that if I could go on for another 50 years, I'd have no hesitation in saying that I would be very busy. When it's no longer possible to get about with the same energy and freedom, a man usually tries to find a way around the difficulty so that he can continue to do the things he wants to do. The question he asks is, what can that obstacle lead to that's new, positive, useful? In my case, the answer has been an intensified awareness of what's always been there to see in my immediate surroundings. Did I express my personality? I think that's quite unimportant, because it's not people's selves that are important, but what they have to say about life that's important. If the things that come close to me today are those literally only a few feet away in our garden at Orgeval, this too is another phase of the voyage.
When we met at the end of his life, I was looking for clues from him about his work. He said, "It's what you see that's important."
Every artist, I suppose, has a sense of what they think has been the importance of their work, but to ask them to define it is not really a very fair question. My real answer would be, the answer is on the wall.
He always used to take 3 newspapers, and then he read them, I don't say every word, but he really read them. And at the end of his life, I was still bringing them, and he threw them away and said, "I don't understand what's happening to the world." And he always thought he understood what was going on, while he didn't understand it. And he always thought things were going to get better in the socialist field, and it never did. I'd go up there and I'd find him petting the photographs like you'd pet a cat or a child. No, they were his woman, they were his children, they were his everything. The love of his life.
He didn't really title his photographs as such. He gave them sort of identifiable names. But the last one, he did give a title. It was A Bird on the Edge of Space.